Ladies and gentlemen, if you're here tonight, it's because you are concerned about our colleges and universities not doing so well, as it were. Maybe you're even very concerned. Well, I hate to be the one to have to say it, but it's worse than many of you think. Remember when we used to fret about grade inflation? At least then nobody was arguing that grading students, or for that matter, the whole concept of academic excellence was racist and colonialist. Remember when political correctness was just deeply annoying. Those were the good old days, ladies and gentlemen. On today's woke campuses, it's not just that someone might wag a finger at you for saying the wrong thing. These days, expressing wrongthink can and does actually ruin careers. Faculty members and students, everyone needs to watch what they say on matters of race or sex. And almost everything is thought to somehow relate to race or sex. And it's not just what you can't say on campus, it's what you must believe. On many campuses, what you must believe can be quite astonishing. Like a man who thinks of himself as a woman actually is a woman and therefore has a legal and constitutional right to play on the women's volleyball team. If you disagree, then you're a hater, even if you're otherwise quite libertarian on the subject. Or, another example, white people are too hung up on the belief that there are right and wrong answers in basic mathematics. If you disagree, it's because of your white fragility. Even if you're not white, it's because of your white fragility. Somehow, it's contagious, I guess. It's weirdly backward. Getting hung up on right or wrong answers in arithmetic is considered bad. On the other hand, a rigid orthodoxy reigns over things that are genuinely contestable. Things like immigration policy, things that really can benefit from all sides of a question. Things like whether Christopher Columbus was a hero or a villain. Only the woke answer is safe to express. And the woke answer always reduces everything down to oppressor and victim, and almost always to race. How did this happen? In particular, how did higher education get to be so race-obsessed? Well, let's talk about that. Colleges and universities have been telling students and faculty that race is the most important thing about them for a long time. Why should anybody be surprised that after all these years, they believe it? There was a brief moment in the mid-1960s, right after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when the nation finally got beyond Jim Crow and adopted a policy of equal treatment regardless of race or ethnicity. It passed a democratically elected Congress, and at the time, polls showed that most Americans were fully behind it. Then, boom, discrimination in favor of underrepresented minorities became fashionable on campuses, and soon thereafter, for all sorts of groups. Despite clear law forbidding it and public opinion opposing it, the courts declined to intervene. Over the last half-century, some Americans have assumed that these preferences were just a tiny thumb on the scale in otherwise close cases. No big deal. But from the start, there have been strong preferences. For example, in the early 2000s at the University of Michigan, an African-American student with a straight B average from high school would be treated the same for admissions purposes as an Asian or white student with straight A's, all of the things being equal. Straight B's, straight A's. That's a real difference. So if you want to know why woke students and woke faculty think that race is important, that's been the message. Don't get me wrong on this. I believe that those who originated these policies were well-meaning. They wanted to integrate African American students into the mainstream as quickly as possible. They thought they were trying to get beyond race, but there were warning signs from the beginning that race preferential admissions were causing students to become too preoccupied with race rather than get beyond it. These warnings were largely ignored. One warning came from the demands, starting in the late 1960s, for racial separatism on campus. African American students who were part of affirmative action programs at schools like Cornell, MIT, and Yale demanded separate dormitories. And as time went on, separate student lounges, separate graduation ceremonies, and sometimes specially designed academic programs. This was a bad sign. Things were going in the opposite direction from what was intended and would eventually devolve into demands for safe spaces and what we're familiar with today. And of course, in a way, we can all understand why one university after another gave in to such calls. Saying yes is so much easier than saying no. It keeps the peace. Saying yes to pressure for further race preferential admissions and faculty hiring is also easy, but it has created long-term problems that are harder to solve today than they would have been decades ago. Not surprisingly, demands for separate dorms and lounges, safe spaces have spread to Latino students, American Indian students, and now Asian students. Here's the most important point I would like to make today. Some people think that given all the affirmative action that has occurred over the last 50 plus years, that our current preoccupation with race on campuses is somehow surprising. But our current situation didn't happen despite race preferential admissions. They happened, sadly, in significant part because of race preferential admissions. Obviously, many things contributed to the situation we have now on campuses, but I believe, sadly, again, that one of the most important wrong turns, maybe the most important, was when universities adopted what they then called affirmative action admission standards. Had they stuck to their principles that race discrimination is wrong, that people should be judged as individuals and not as racial groups, we would have far fewer problems on campuses today. Things would have evolved differently. They wouldn't be perfect, but they'd be different, and I believe quite a bit better. None of this is easy to talk about at this point, so please bear with me as I try to take it step by step. The fateful decision began more than 50 years ago, and it was to lower admission standards for African American elite colleges and universities, and soon thereafter, although to a lesser degree, Hispanic students, American Indian students, all in order to increase the number of minority students on those campuses and ultimately to promote their integration into high-status careers. Back when it first started, most of these college and university administrators and faculty members were almost certainly believed in the principle of colorblindness, but they thought they could compromise that principle for just a little while, for a good cause. They thought they could jumpstart the long overdue business of integrating African Americans into the mainstream, and then go back to the principle of colorblindness later, in a short period. But that deviation from principle had an important consequence. It meant that on average, the academic credentials of underrepresented minority students on any given campus would be below average for that campus, even though those minority students might be excellent students compared to college students generally. But that credential staff is not a small thing as much as we wish it to be. I am sad to report that very few prominent conservatives or centrists spoke up in favor of the principle of non-discrimination when all this was getting started. Instead, As George was just telling you, the most prominent voices against race preferential admissions back in the early days came from liberals. Take Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. He was no conservative, let me tell you that. He was a big government, New Deal progressive, but to his everlasting credit, he was also a champion of civil rights and an enemy of Jim Crow. Douglas took the unusual step of dissenting when the Supreme Court spinelessly declined to hear the case of Innes versus Odegaard, an early case concerning affirmative action admissions at colleges and universities. Even more impressive was California Supreme Court Justice Stanley Mosk. Up to then, Mosk had always been a liberal's liberal, but that included standing up against racial discrimination, as liberals did back in the day. When faced with the argument that discrimination in favor of some races is okay, Mosk was appalled. The case was Bakke versus the University of California. University of California Board of Regents, that's the actual official name. It came before the California Supreme Court in 1976. Alan Bakke was a white Vietnam vet. He'd been a medic in the war. He desperately wanted to go to medical school. He was hardly a child of privilege. His father had been a mailman in the state. Despite having college grades and standardized test scores that were much higher than the 16 minority students who were admitted instead, Bakke was denied entry. Writing for the majority of the California Supreme Court, Mosk called UC Davis's admissions policy a dubious expedient. And as George mentioned, I like that term. I think that's pretty descriptive here. I put the title of the anthology in my book, and I put it in the title of this talk, actually. And I think it about sums it up. Universities thought they were engaging in the good kind of race discrimination, a temporary shortcut to a more just world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it turns out there isn't a good kind of race discrimination. Mosk's full quote is as follows. To uphold the university would call for the sacrifice of principle for the sake of dubious expediency and would represent a retreat in the struggle to assure that each man and woman shall be judged on the basis of individual merit alone, a struggle which has only lately achieved success in removing legal barriers to racial equality. Justice Mosk, blessing, understood something basic about race discrimination. Throughout history, the temptation to engage in it has almost always come packaged with a justification that many found appealing at the time. But whenever the country has succumbed to that temptation, it has always come to regret it. By 1976, when Mosk was writing, we owed it to ourselves to be a lot more skeptical. Mosk's decision was instantly denounced by angry protesters. When he visited campuses, he routinely found himself greeted by picketers and hecklers. But Mosk himself was undaunted. I'm quoting him here. He said, "Judges in California cannot be intimidated. Lawsuits are won and lost in the courtroom, not on the streets." You gotta love it. You really do. You gotta love it. Alas, Mosk's vision of civil rights did not prevail. His opinion was soon superseded by a decision of the United States Supreme Court. In that fractured decision, 4 justices, mostly conservatives, thought it was a clear violation of the law. 4 were apparently untroubled by the race discrimination involved in the case. And one justice, conservative, Lewis Howell, a guy who didn't like conflict. He was the man in the middle. Howell didn't want to see protests. He tied himself in knots to come up with a way that Bakke could win his case, but the universities could continue to discriminate by race. He ended up essentially saying that the UC could discriminate as long as, all at once, as long as it did so for the sake of diversity and as long as it didn't set aside a specific number of seats for racial minorities. With that, Bakke technically won the case, but since the UC had set aside a number of seats, that's a win for Bakke, but the door was wide open for very, very different admission standards based on race. Powell went for the dubious expediency. He avoided short-term unpleasantness, but he created long-term problems. This was a pattern that would later be followed by two more center-right conservative members of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor in 2003 and Anthony Kennedy in 2016. The long-term problems that were created by this were really big and very complex. First of all, Powell had created an incentive for minority students to dwell on differences. That's the whole point of the diversity rationale, that when students are different from each other, they learn from each other. So of course, students have to try hard to be as different as they can from each other. More importantly, Powell institutionalized a policy under which underrepresented minority students who receive an affirmative action bump would be spending their college years competing against students with much better academic credentials. That has serious consequences, as much as we wish that it would not. As I'm sure you know and everybody knows, there are terrific students of all races and of all ethnicities. But there are fewer underrepresented minority students who have the academic credentials that would allow them to be admitted to very, very top schools. And so what happens? When a very top school engages in preferential treatment, then the schools that are one rung down must do likewise, or they will have far fewer underrepresented minority students than they would have had under a general colorblind policy. The problem is then passed on to the schools another rung down, which respond similarly. As a result, students from underrepresented minorities today are concentrated at the bottom of the distribution of entering academic credentials at almost all selected colleges and universities. I can't emphasize enough that the problem isn't that there are no academically gifted underrepresented minority students. There are many. Just not enough at the very top to satisfy the demands, and efforts to change that have had a pernicious effect up and down the academic pecking order. Unfortunately, and this is an important point, a student whose entering credentials are well below the average at a particular school is likely to earn grades to match. This is true whether the preference received is based on race, athletic talent, parents' alumni status, parents' wealth, parents' political clout, any of these. And the reason is simple. Entering credentials actually matter. While some students will outperform their entering credentials, just as some students will underperform theirs. Most students will perform in the range that their entering credentials suggest. No serious person who has this information, no one disputes that affirmative action beneficiaries, on average, get low grades. The late William Bowen and Derek Bach, both former Ivy League presidents and two of the strongest apologists for racial preferences and admissions, they created the system. They admitted candidly that African American grades in college are, on average, and I'm quoting them here, startlingly low. That has created, over the last few decades, a lot of the pressure for grade inflation and for watered-down curriculum. And it has still deeper effects on campus culture. Somebody has to be at the bottom of every class, but if it's you, and nearly every one of the group you perceive yourself as a member of, you're going to start wondering. You're going to start thinking, hey, maybe something's wrong here. Maybe, for example, it's all politics, you might think. Or the standards by which people people are being judged here are corrupt, you might think. Or maybe even, the teachers are racist. It's not going to affect all minority students, but it will affect many, and it will affect some quite a bit. It's going to have an effect on campus culture, and 50 years of this has taken its toll. One thing you might expect, given this problem, is that some minority members will start thinking, I want to hang out with people who are like me. And this has almost certainly had quite a bit to do with the pressure for campus separatism and for safe spaces generally. It is entirely possible, likely in my view, that this has had something to do with the rise of political correctness more generally. And even of hate speech posts on campuses that started in the 1980s. When students aren't doing well in their studies, they're going to feel a little out of place. They're going to worry that they are being viewed as tokens. That tends to cause people to get a bit sensitive, and sometimes they might even look for respect in ways that are ultimately unproductive for everybody. But let me switch gears here, because there's an even bigger reason that race preferential admissions are a problem. For many years now, there has been strong evidence that these policies just plain don't work. Rather than helping underrepresented minority students to enter high prestige careers, this research shows that they're doing just the opposite. They hinder them. If this research is correct, and I believe it is, we would have more African American scientists, more African American physicians, dentists, engineers, if elite colleges and universities had engaged in race-neutral admissions. The evidence is strongest in the area of science and engineering, so that's what I'll talk about most. But the evidence isn't confined to science and engineering. We very likely would have more college professors generally who are African American. Getting good grades in college makes students more enthusiastic about going on to graduate school and becoming a college professor. More lawyers, too, more African American lawyers. But let me talk about STEM. Many students of all races who start out majoring in STEM eventually switch to something easier. Some drop out of school altogether, and a few even flunk out. But it should surprise nobody in the world to know that those who fail to attain their goal of getting a degree in science or engineering are disproportionately students whose entering academic credentials put them towards the bottom of their college class. Not all stereotypes about STEM students are accurate, but the notion they tend to be highly credentialed and hardworking, that's largely on topic. They have to be. What some does surprise people, what some people are surprised about, is that several unrebutted empirical studies have demonstrated that part of the effect is relative. An aspiring science or engineering student is more likely to attain that STEM degree if their entering academic credentials put them in the middle or towards the top of their class. They're more likely to succeed than an otherwise identical student with exactly the same entering credentials who attends a school where they are able to compete, where they're at least in the middle, than a student who has those same credentials but is towards the bottom of the class. So putting that somewhat differently, an aspiring science or engineering major would be very smart to attend a school where their entering credentials compare favorably to the students in the class. In yet other words, affirmative action preferences end up hurting. They don't help. The students who get into top STEM schools like MIT or Caltech on the basis of a preference are still very, very impressive students. But they are competing against students from around the world who have been living and breathing science and engineering since they were in elementary school. Teenage rocket scientists, as it were. In other words, these preference recipients may be enrolling in one of the only schools on the planet Earth where they will come out as French literature or public relations majors instead. And there's nothing wrong with majoring in French literature or public relations. But that wasn't their dream. They went to MIT or Caltech because they wanted to become a doctor or a computer scientist or an engineer. So 3 conservative Supreme Court justices, first Powell, then Sandra Day O'Connor, and then Anthony Kennedy, all had the opportunity to put an end to this. All 3 took the easy way out, refusing to uphold the basic principle that states should not discriminate on the basis of race. As a result, the system has become more and more entrenched. Maybe, just maybe, the court will take up the issue this upcoming year in the form of a lawsuit. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, it's called. And the new wrinkle there is that the worst of the discrimination turns out to be against Asian Americans, not whites. I wonder if Powell, O'Connor, and Kennedy saw that coming. But it's the case. And often we are talking about Asian Americans who are recent immigrants, who are not well off. I'm crossing my fingers that the court will take the case, or maybe the UNC case has already been decided at the district level. Take it another year or so to get up to the Supreme Court level. But there are things that can be done even if the Supreme Court declines to take either of those cases. And I don't just mean resisting the many manifestations of wokeness on campus today. That has to be done, of course. Donors and legislators need to stop funding woke schools and programs. Alumni need to voice their displeasure. When speakers are deplatformed, as they frequently are these days, we need to make sure that they get bigger and better platforms from which to speak. But we also need to do things about the roots of wokeness, with race preferential admissions being, I think, the single most important such root. In California, 25 years ago, we passed Proposition 209. We amended the state constitution to say, and I'm quoting it here, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, color, sex, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. Those words reflect one of the country's core values, I think, equal treatment under the law. I am therefore proud that I was second only to our chairman, UC Regent Ward Connolly, in the leadership of that campaign back in the 1990s. I was 12 years old at the time. The effects on the University of California system, at least in the first several years, were amazing. It was exactly what the research that I told you about a minute ago would have predicted. According to a study done by Duke University's Peter Arcidiacono, when Proposition 209 went into effect in California, it helped close the entry credentials gap. What did that do? Well, as a result, system-wide in the University of California, grades went way up for African American students. So did the number who successfully graduated with a major in science or engineering, and so did graduation rates for African American students. It was a triple crown. We got exactly what we expected to get. Think about how hard that is to achieve all 3 of those goals at the same time. STEM courses are usually graded more harshly than, say, English literature courses. For the number of STEM majors to increase at the same time that grade point averages were going up for African American students, that is no mean feat. That required something important to be happening. So over the years, the University of California tried to get around Proposition 209, but they were never able to successfully get all the way around it. That's why last year the California legislature knocked itself out to repeal Proposition 209. Fortunately, it had to be put to a vote of the people. Many of the old Prop 209 gang, as well as a number of new faces, put together a campaign to fight the repeal effort as fast as possible. Why throw your money down the toilet? As a result, our opponents had something like 16 times more money than we had. But miracle of miracles, turned out that money didn't matter so much. They had the big money, and the mainstream media, boy, did they have the mainstream media. But we had the fundamental American principle of equality before the law, and we had the dedicated volunteers, many of whom, by the way, turned out to be Chinese Americans. That was a huge factor in our campaign. And it turned out, there wasn't close. Together, we defeated the repeal effort, even in deep blue California. Californians believe in equal protection under the law. North Carolina doesn't have a citizen initiative system like California's, so it cannot follow in quite the same pattern as did Washington State, Michigan, Nebraska, Arizona, all of which did follow California on that. But that doesn't leave it defenseless. It can amend the state constitution through a referendum process, whereby the state legislature puts the process in motion and voters must ultimately decide. And as many of you know, that course of action is currently being considered. Note that it would not prevent North Carolina state universities from lending an extra hand to students on the basis of economic disadvantage. Black, white, Asian, Latino, whoever needs the help. Colleges right now are entirely too expensive for one thing, and that's one way we can help. Too many frills, way too many administrators. Helping economically disadvantaged students in that way and other ways could be a great thing. And that goes beyond public education, by the way. Proposition 209 includes, for example, public contracting. Assuming a business is disadvantaged because the owner is female or black or Latino is not allowed, but special programs for small businesses that have just gotten started, perfectly legal under Proposition 209 in California. I do hope that the North Carolina legislature gives such a constitutional amendment the consideration it deserves. But here's my bottom line, because I'm getting hungry now. Until Americans start looking at the roots of identity politics, woke identity politics are going to be with us on campus. And they will be destructive not just of academic values, they will be destructive of the deeply American value of equal treatment under the law. Nothing we can do at this point is going to fix the problem quickly. Wish I could. But 50 years were taken to get us to this point. It's going to probably take 50 years, maybe a little less, to get us out. 50 years of what I consider cowardice got us where we are today. Cowardice on the part of Supreme Court members. But 50 years of some courage, maybe with luck a little less than 50 years, 50 years of courage and dedication to principle, I am confident they can get us out of this problem. We just have to get started and do it. So thank you all, and with that, I'm going to have dinner.